Welcome back to Aether Hour, everybody. I'm your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalyagin, and we are here with our first episode of the new year, and we're going to be looking back on some of the craziness that was 2023. It was our first full year of doing the show, so every week we brought you something in 2023, so we've got a lot to say, and there really was some crazy stuff looking back from, obviously we're going to talk about October 7th, and of course there was the whole Prigozhin episode, the rise of BRICS, some of these other things, but yeah, I mean, we're going to look back on 2023 and then make some predictions for 2024 here before we dive back into World War Now later this week. So, Dimitri, how are you doing? How was your New Year's?
It was good, yeah. It was a good celebration as we're moving into, of course, old calendar Orthodox Christmas. I mean, it's just a great time between, say, I don't know, I want to say Thanksgiving and Orthodox Christmas is just a very joyous time. Lots of interaction with family, friends, and just an amazing time to spend with everybody. And of course, following the news is always exciting because, end of the year, things get revealed. A lot of people have reflections, and here we are. I think we're going to give some of our reflections for 2023 here. And I mean, it was such an intense year, I want to say. Everybody thought 2022 was the intense year. If anything, I feel like 2021 was the year where things stood still. 22 was an escalation, and 2023 just built onto that escalation. And so I think there's just so many stories, and naturally, beginning from October 7th, things escalated completely out of proportion to what anybody, I think, had predicted in the Middle East. And yeah, I think let's just get into it. The beginning, right? I think my first grand memory of the year naturally was the continuation of the Battle of Bakhmut, which everybody wrote about, lots of news articles. But the siege of Bakhmut, they call it the largest siege of the 21st century in terms of size, scale, shells used. Prigozhin said that we used at Bakhmut almost 10,000 shells per day. There was many victims. Again, we're looking at Ukrainian losses of men and women, service people, and mercenaries. Naturally, looking at somewhere between 30 and 50,000 people dead, perhaps. And again, these numbers may be exaggerated, but from what we saw, the Battle of Bakhmut lasted about 5 to 6 months, starting in late 2022 and continuing on until I think May 2023. So that's the beginning of the year, started with the Battle of Bakhmut, and the entire first half of 23, we were just essentially recapping as what exactly took place in Bakhmut, and it was this intense stalemate which nobody really could break. It was like a massive battle of Stalingrad, which ended, I suppose, for not the aggressor, but I would say the liberator in this case, because Bakhmut is one of the Donetsk towns and mining cities which the people of Donetsk had authority over for a very long time, and suddenly Ukrainians came in, Ukrainian neo-Nazis, they turned it into this massive fortress, and now it's essentially, after all that shelling, it has turned into, again, essentially a post-apocalyptic wasteland now at the end of, in early 2024, you can say. But yeah, very just a very powerful memory. Remember, we had all that footage. It was just very combat heavy start to the year.
Again, the Russia situation really, it's kind of still been the central focus of what we've been covering. And like I wanted to say, in many ways, World War III started in 2021. We started covering it that same year. 2022 is when people started, more people started noticing it was happening. Then 2023, the whole world was forced to realize that we're dealing with World War III, especially on October 7th, which we're going to get into. But when it comes to Bakhmut, of course, now here we are, 2024. Bakhmut is Russian city, I guess Artemovsk, if you want to call it that, but we still call it Bakhmut here on World War Now. For we're imperial posters here. But as far as some of the other big things in Russia, I mean, I think we just have to get into the biggest thing that happened coming out of that battle, of course. And really, I would say from the perspective of our show, if it wasn't for October 7th, it wouldn't be debatable, right? It would have been the Prigozhin episode, would have been the kind of the highlight of the year as far as just insanity goes. I mean, the coup in and of itself would have been crazy enough, but the fact that his plane was then blown out of the sky in some capacity with Utkin, and he's now, I mean, look, it's been a pretty long time at this point. He's probably dead. There was a funeral and everything. So the fact that all of that happened in the course of a few months is just, even a few weeks, really, if you think about the coup and that, but just the whole Prigozhin saga of his rise to being one of the most famous people in the world for leading his mercenary coalition, the prisoners and the whole saga of Wagner and how they supposedly were, the only ones holding the line and pushing forward for, probably over 6 months of the operation, if some would might have you believe. And now, of course, they've been fully integrated into the Russian military. But I think we did a whole paywall show about our take on it at the time. Has your take on what happened changed at all, Dimitri, on the Prigozhin saga, whether it's the coup, whether it's who took him out in the plane, whether it's, you know, what Wagner was to begin with, with the legacy. What is your perspective? Because just looking back on that, it was truly crazy that, I think, especially imagining as someone who wasn't covering it, it probably seemed even weirder, even more cinematic with the fact that we were covering it every week. It's like, oh man, it almost didn't seem real.
Yeah, I think the most unreal factor of it was the fact that it was similar to a movie. So you'd have, as we mentioned, the Battle of Bakhmut, and who were the main participants in Bakhmut? It was the Wagner mercenary group, and so they were being hyped all over Russian news. I mean, American news, or and essentially all media sources were saying Wagner is sieging Bakhmut, not the Russian military, but Wagner is doing it. And of course, once they succeeded, Wagner were raised up on the shields as victors, and naturally, this kind of played into maybe Prigozhin's ego growing out of proportion and perhaps him receiving a certain signal. This is my version that he probably was told on the inside that he could actually possibly take out Gerasimov and Shoigu on the inside, bring some sort of people's justice to the Ministry of Defense, and whether or not it was a full-on conspiracy in order to, remove Putin or anything of that sort, I'm not too sure. But definitely the fact that he stopped does show that there were people on the inside who probably told him that he went too far. Lukashenko's involvement here is very interesting too, and naturally, Lukashenko, a leader of a foreign country coming to Russia and actually playing as a middle person, as a certain diplomat, instead of say Putin or Shoigu meeting with Prigozhin in person, was, I think, somewhat embarrassing for the Russian establishment. Not saying it was embarrassment to Putin generally personally, but what we saw, the outcomes, the ramifications of that was, of course, Turkey's great betrayal, the ending of the grain deal, Erdogan acting extremely disrespectfully towards Putin, and I think that kind of has continued to where Turkey today is supporting Israel of all countries completely unrepentantly, and basically does not care at all what Russia's opinion is on foreign policy. I think that's partially, I don't want to say Oriental mindset, but that's perhaps that Middle Eastern mindset of, well, you have to kind of display your power, you have to display your authority, and authority by the Kremlin was not displayed in this Prigozhin event. And naturally, the 24th of August, Prigozhin's sudden death alongside Colonel Dmitry Utkin and the other personnel of Wagner, that wasn't, if anything, that was a scummy assassination, which, let's face it, the gematria, the Kabbalistic numerology here, Conrad, 24th of February 22, right? We see that same number, 24, 24th of June 2023. That's when the actual rebellion happens and when the Wagner forces drive at Moscow through Voronezh, through Rostov-on-Don. And the 24th of August is when Prigozhin is suddenly killed in a surprise murder or a terrorist act, right? And of course, later Putin comes out during an interview and it just says, well, allegedly they were high on cocaine potentially when we couldn't get a toxicology report. Maybe they were throwing grenades around. Like, it's just a very bizarre story. Nothing really makes sense. But my main takeaway from the Prigozhin revolt, besides the fact that Russia really needed internal defenses to be up to scratch, right, was the fact that what we saw, Conrad, when the actual revolt happened on the 24th and the 23rd, as soon as Prigozhin started driving in Moscow and there were these signs of, well, perhaps an arising civil war, the entire Russian church naturally began even praying against and for God to prevent a civil war, which, the patriarch, the bishops took this very seriously in Russia. But the most important thing is the Russian elites, we're talking about the oligarchs, the businessmen, even certain politicians, oppositionary politicians, perhaps even members of United Russia, Putin's own party, Medvedev's party, Shoigu's party. People started getting on planes and flying away out of Moscow, out of St. Petersburg, towards countries like Estonia, literally NATO countries. And we saw this because the plane tickets from Moscow and Petersburg shot up 10 times, 15 times. Well, they were all brought out. All of the oligarchs, the rich people, started leaving Moscow and Petersburg when the enemy was approaching, the enemy being Prigozhin and Wagner, right? So there is an existing fifth column, and I think this completely justifies Dugin's entire position for the last 10 years that Russia has an existing fifth column. It has these bizarre elites. Perhaps they are ethnically Russian. Maybe they are, maybe they hold dual citizenships. Some of them, of course, hold Israeli citizenships, and they are not going to stay in Russia to defend their homeland if things get tough. And I think that's what the Prigozhin revolt has shown. It's just the rats will start jumping off the ship into the water. As soon as the ship will start sinking, the rats will start swimming. And this was disgusting, and we saw that live on that weekend on the 24th. And so, it happened during the Shabbat, but that didn't stop some of these people, right? So and then Shoigu, naturally did not appear. It was very, very bizarre, and I think this mystery will probably only get solved after, perhaps even after Putin's, either he passes away or he resigns, because I think the contemporary elite, not Putin himself, but those around him, are trying to really hush up exactly what took place in the middle of 2023. And I'm not sure if we'll ever get the official position. Perhaps decades later, the archives will be searched and they'll find out exactly who made certain orders. Why did all those pilots need to die? Who ordered the helicopters to fly at the Wagner column? So many questions, right? And for me, it continues to remain an internal oligarchic coup attempt. Yes, Prigozhin wasn't a perfect guy. Certain things he said were correct. Malafeyev, Konstantin Malafeyev, Alexander Dugin even agreed with him on the Tsargrad platform. And, a lot of people were saying, well, Prigozhin does have a few correct points, but should he begin a revolt? Should he start killing helicopter pilots? These are all really ethically ambiguous questions, I think, in this particular case. And Putin's very powerful statement comparing this to World War One, again, important because World War One was probably the most slandered war in Russian history, and suddenly Putin comes out and says the Russians were betrayed by both the liberals and the Bolsheviks in World War One. I think some pretty powerful ramifications rhetorically as well as philosophically from the entire year, especially this Prigozhin revolt and him suddenly dying. This story came to an abrupt end. It began at Bakhmut in 23 and it ended on the 24th of August, and we still don't have any answers. And all we received was a Prigozhin closed Orthodox funeral, and you can visit his gravesite today in Moscow, or on the outskirts of Moscow, and that's all we basically have. There's no conclusion. This is just the epilogue of the story, and we're left with questions.
Yeah, the revolt itself will always be a fairly I don't know if anybody in our lifetimes will ever learn who was funding what and who was motivated by what faction and what Putin really thought about the whole thing. Of course, that's what everyone wants to know, but we can only speculate. As far as Prigozhin and Utkin and the assassination, I'm wondering, do you think it was the Russians? I think, there's a possibility it was French intelligence. I think the Africa stuff and everything going on makes that definitely a possibility. But besides them, do you think it's more likely it was a Russian internal assassination from some wing of the government, or was it possible the Ukrainians managed to make that happen? I mean, those are the two biggest parties involved. I'm inclined towards the French in some regard. Obviously, certain factions in the Middle East would have a reason to want to as well, but that starts to get a bit more tenuous. So, of course, this all is in the realm of speculation as well, but I'm wondering if you have a different opinion on who may have been behind it than you might have immediately.
Well, yeah, initially, or at least in the first few weeks of World War Now, after the event itself, in August, September, my personal opinion was that, yes, it was probably either French intelligence, which had to do with Wagner's African meddling in some of these countries which were revolting, right? Which, highly possible. France does have a very, powerful intelligence agency in Russia, and it isn't exactly the most secure place, as the SBU has shown over the last year and a half, that yes, assassinations are completely possible. Unfortunately, and terrorist activity on Russian soil is something which foreign intelligence agencies seems to have perfected on Russian land. And so Russia does need to kind of tighten up some of its defenses on that particular front. But yes, the airport was completely commercial. And initially I thought, well, it must have been the SBU or the French intelligence or MI6 or perhaps even the CIA, right? Turns out no, it's based on Putin's comments about throwing around a grenade, and I want to say Putin probably received a report of some sort. And he probably knows who actually did it or who was involved, but those people will not be prosecuted, at least not in the open. And that makes me think that there was some probably very powerful oligarchic. Thank you for listening to the free segment of our latest Aether Hour episode. For the full uncensored episode, visit our World War Now Substack to subscribe. You can find the link in the description. In this full episode, we go over some of the major events of the past year: the siege of Bakhmut, Putin's International Criminal Court warrant, the success of the BRICS summit, and the short legacy of Yevgeny Prigozhin himself. Of course, the persecution of the Orthodox Church in Ukraine is covered, and the unfortunate genocide of the Palestinian people. Be sure to listen to the very end of the episode to hear our 2024 predictions, and we'll see at the end of the year if any of them come to pass. Thank you for your support.